At age 52, Jason Kidd stands on the NBA sidelines like a living record of American basketball history, carrying a career where the list of achievements alone is enough to place him among the rare class of the truly great. Rookie of the Year in 1995, 10-time NBA All-Star, 6-time All-NBA honoree, 9-time All-Defensive Team selection, 2-time league leader in assists, one of the very few players in history to surpass 12,000 assists and 2,500 steals, 2 Olympic gold medals with Team USA in 2000 and 2008, an NBA championship in 2011 with the Dallas Mavericks, at an age when most point guards have already become memories, and finally, induction into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, as confirmation that Jason Kidd was not just excellent, he was a standard. He is admired for his rare tactical intelligence, his ability to read the game before it unfolds, his ice-cold composure that turns chaos into order, and a leadership style that doesn't need flash, where teammates simply play better because he's there. But if achievements are what people easily see, the cost behind them is the part very few want to look straight at. Behind the numbers, Jason Kidd is a man who had to shoulder responsibility too early, lived in the role of leader too long, and made personal mistakes that will never be erased from public memory. He has endured unforgiving judgment, moments when people turned their backs, physical pain accumulated over years of playing without dramatic tragedy, for outsiders to pity only quiet erosion. No more soundtrack when he stands on the sideline. No more applause reserved for the name that once controlled the tempo of games, only cold lights shining down on the familiar hardwood, and a man who knows very well that a leader is not allowed to fall. Jason Kidd doesn't stand there to be celebrated. His entire life has taught him that walking away has never been an easy option. He doesn't seek forgiveness, doesn't try to rewrite the past. He chooses to keep working, keep taking responsibility, keep leading in silence. And it is in that very silence, between the faded glory and the scars that never disappear, that the most painful question still hangs in the air. How many years of responsibility, mistakes, and judgment must one endure before finally being allowed to stop, not as a legend, but simply as an ordinary human being? If you want to understand what truly shaped the man Jason Kidd behind the titles and the lights, subscribe to the channel and keep following us in the next part of this story. Jason Kidd's childhood did not begin with clear dreams or safe afternoons where adults waited on the porch. It started in a harsh Oakland, where violence, poverty, and competition crowded every street corner, a place where a child learned to observe before learning to hope, and learned to stay silent before knowing how to voice what he feared. There, life did not allow romance. It forced people to stay alert, to be quick, to be tough, because a single moment of carelessness was enough to be swallowed whole. In the family, love was not expressed in words. Discipline ranked higher than emotion, and weakness was seen as a luxury unfit for the reality of survival. No one taught Jason how to express sadness because there was no time for it. No one asked if he was okay because everyone was trying to survive in their own way. That boy early understood that to survive, he first had to learn to suppress, to hide, to control every reflex from his eyes to his words, because showing too much meant handing the world the power to hurt him. Oakland taught Jason Kidd a cold but effective lesson. Stay silent to avoid being hurt. Stay in control to avoid being consumed. And always stand tall, even when trembling inside. Basketball appeared as a rare space where he could breathe. But even there, it was not a carefree game. It was rules, tempo, absolute control, where a small mistake could cost failure, and a right decision could save the whole team from collapse. Jason didn't play to be noticed. He played to maintain order, to master chaos, to turn what was out of control into something calculable, and that habit sank deep into him before he even realized it. While other kids were still dreaming, Jason was already learning to observe adults, read faces, predict reactions, because in Oakland, understanding what was about to happen was sometimes more important than hoping for something good. That childhood did not create hope in the sweet sense. It did not teach Jason to believe things would eventually be okay. It taught him that things are only okay if he keeps himself together, controls the situation, stands firm when no one stands with him. And from there, a thick shell gradually formed, not to show off or defend against the lights, but to survive each ordinary day. Emotions were pushed to the bottom, not gone, just locked tight, and over time, that lock became habit, even identity. Jason Kidd grew up with a composure that others admired, but few understood that composure came not from peace, but from suppressing for too long. Oakland gave him no gentleness, but it forged his ability to stand firm under pressure, to keep a cool head amid chaos, and to lead without saying too much, qualities that later made Jason a rare kind of leader, but also made him a stranger to his own emotions. When success arrived, people saw a cold, controlled, hard-to-approach Jason Kidd, but few looked back at the boy who once walked Oakland streets with survival instincts taught in every step. That childhood left no beautiful memories to recount. It left reflexes, layers of defense, habits of silence that followed Jason his whole life, making him someone who could endure pressure more than most, but also someone who found it hard to allow himself to be weak, even when no one forced him to be strong anymore. And it was from that harsh foundation that Jason Kidd's journey moved into the next phase, where talent brought him into the light, but the shell built in Oakland followed him every step, protecting him from the world, while quietly preventing him from touching the most fragile parts of himself. Jason Kidd's genius was not discovered gradually like a talent needing time to mature. It was yanked into the light before he even understood who he was, before he could live a single full day as an ordinary young man. After harsh Oakland, basketball was no longer just a refuge. It became the stage where all eyes focused, where praise like genius, rare brain, born leader, arrived earlier than inner maturity. Jason Kidd was called a genius while he was still groping for himself, and that early praise unwittingly turned talent into chains. From that moment, he was no longer allowed to fail like others, no longer allowed to experiment and stumble, no longer allowed to learn through failure the natural way of youth. The world decided Jason Kidd was someone who had to know what he was doing, even when he had never been asked who he wanted to become. When he entered the NBA, Jason Kidd was not treated like a rookie learning the ropes, but like a grown man carrying the responsibility of the entire group. Immediately, he was handed the keys to the game, required to read situations, set the tempo, control the emotions of teammates and himself. No transition period, no safe zone where mistakes were forgiven. Every decision was magnified, every play dissected, every hesitation seen as a sign of weakness. Jason Kidd quickly understood that the NBA was not a place to find himself. It was a place that forced people to arrive with a fully formed identity. And so, he put on the jersey of a leader while inside, he was still a boy who hadn't finished growing. At an age when many players were still struggling with the league's speed and physicality, Jason had to learn to take responsibility for others' failures. When the team lost, eyes turned to him. When the offense broke down, people waited for him to fix it. When tension rose, he had to be the one staying calm, even as he himself was caught in the whirlwind of pressure. No one said it out loud, but the message was always there. A genius is not allowed to be weak. And Jason Kidd, with all the survival instincts forged in Oakland, accepted it like fate. He didn't resist, didn't complain. He only tightened discipline on himself, pushing emotions deeper down where they could not interrupt focus. But the price of growing up too soon was quiet loneliness. Jason Kidd played with the mind of someone seasoned, but his heart had never learned how to rest. He had no space for confusion because confusion was seen as weakness, He had no time to trial and error, because every mistake was branded disappointment. He was only allowed to carry. Carry the game's tempo, carry the coach's expectations, carry teammates' trust, and carry the judgment of people who had never stepped into his shoes. Gradually, Jason Kidd became so composed that he seemed cold to outsiders, but that was not natural confidence. It was the result of never allowing himself to waver. Talent, which should have been wings, instead became the skeleton, forcing Jason to stand straight even when exhausted. Each season passed. The burden didn't lighten it, only became more familiar. People got used to Jason Kidd always being ready, always knowing what to do, always fixing others' mistakes. And that familiarity meant he was no longer seen as a person still learning, but as a machine that had to operate perfectly. When he succeeded, it was taken for granted. When he stumbled, it was deemed unacceptable failure. No middle ground for growth, no gray area for the learning process. At some level, Jason Kidd understood that if he allowed himself to stop, everything would collapse, not because he wasn't good enough, but because the system around him had grown accustomed to leaning on him as a pillar. And so, he kept walking, kept carrying, kept wearing the image of a perfect leader rather than a human still growing up. Emotions, already locked from Oakland, were now buried even deeper under new layers of responsibility. He was not allowed to ask what if, not allowed to try another path, not allowed to admit that he too was still learning how to survive in a world too big. Genius thrust into the spotlight too early often pays the price with years of freedom they can never get back. For Jason Kidd, that spotlight didn't just illuminate his talent. It exposed him to the harsh expectations of a league with no patience. And while the world kept calling him a genius, a born leader, a rare basketball mind, Jason Kidd quietly understood a different truth. From very early on, he was no longer allowed to be an ordinary person. He was only allowed to carry, and from that moment, the road ahead for Jason Kidd was shaped not by what he wanted to try, but by what he was forced to endure. When Jason Kidd put on the New Jersey Nets jersey and led that team into the NBA Finals, the world saw the perfect leader exactly as they had expected from the day he entered the league. Calm, intelligent, controlling the tempo as if every bit of chaos was part of the plan. But very few saw what happened behind the lights, where power brought no protection, and the role of leader meant standing alone under millions of eyes. Jason Kidd was trusted completely, but that trust came without sharing. It came with the responsibility to always be right, always be clear-headed, always be the last one allowed to fall. When the Nets won, the victory was shared across the team, the system, the strategy. When the Nets lost, the eyes turned back to Jason Kidd. No words of blame needed. Just the silence was heavy enough. He made decisions for others, read situations for others, fixed mistakes for others, but no one carried with him the invisible consequences of those decisions. 2 straight trips to the NBA Finals. Jason Kidd took a team no one rated highly and turned it into an Eastern Conference force. And it was in those seasons that his image became etched as a coach on the floor, the one who saw the game before it happened. But that tactical power brought no warmth. Instead, it pushed him into a subtle kind of isolation, where everyone leaned on him but rarely stood beside him. Teammates believed he would find the way out, coaches believed he would control the flow, management believed he would carry the team's image, and fans believed he would not make mistakes. In such a closed circle, Jason Kidd had no room to doubt himself, because if he doubted, the whole system would waver. He was forced to become the pillar, even as invisible cracks began to appear inside. The loneliness of a leader doesn't come from having no one around. It comes from not being allowed to lean on anyone. Jason Kidd understood that very clearly during those long playoff nights when pressure piled up and every decision could decide the fate of the entire season. He stood there, back straight, eyes focused, while tens of thousands watched every move, every pass, every moment of hesitation. No one asked if he was tired, if he was scared, because a leader isn't asked those things. A leader is only expected to do the right thing. And Jason Kidd, with the survival instincts forged in Oakland and the steel discipline of an early maturing genius, kept carrying that role without showing any sign of wavering. But absolute trust is also a form of isolation. When everyone believes you'll always be okay, they don't think to stand by you when you're not. Jason Kidd became the center of the system, but he was also separated from the normal emotions of a human being. He wasn't allowed to celebrate too long because more responsibility waited ahead. He wasn't allowed to grieve after a loss because he had to be the one calming everyone else. His emotions were compressed, not because he had none, but because there was no space for them to exist. And over time, that very compression created distance between him and the world around him, a distance that even the bright lights of the NBA Finals couldn't fill. When the Nets fell short in those final games, Jason Kidd stood there as the one bearing ultimate responsibility, even though he wasn't the only one on the floor. He didn't hide, didn't blame, didn't make excuses. His silence wasn't arrogance. It was the habit of a leader accustomed to carrying the heaviest part. But that very silence made him increasingly misunderstood as cold, distant, even emotionless. Few realized that behind that controlled exterior was a man slowly learning to live with loneliness as an inseparable part of the role he carried. The leader alone under millions of eyes was the greatest paradox of Jason Kidd in that peak period. He had power on the court, but no shelter when he left it. He was respected, but rarely embraced. He was the one everyone trusted in decisive moments, but also the one who had to endure alone when things didn't go as planned. And it was in that loneliness that Jason Kidd continued to mature in the harshest way, not through joy or recognition, but through the ability to stand firm when no one stood with him. This was the price of becoming a leader, a price not recorded in stat sheets, not mentioned in praise songs, but etched deeply into every decision he was forced to make, every long night he had to face alone, and every step forward on a road where turning back was no longer an option. After those tense playoff nights and seasons where Jason Kidd carried the responsibility of an entire group on his shoulders, people often think family would be the place where he could shed the leader role, where power and pressure gave way to protection and understanding. But for Jason Kidd, family was never truly a refuge. It became a second battlefield, where unresolved issues from the court quietly exploded in private space. The greatest tragedy of this period wasn't in the losses or the titles that slipped away. It was in the disconnect between the man he had become on the court and the man he didn't know how to be at home. Jason Kidd entered marriage with the same instincts that had helped him survive and win in the NBA: control, discipline, silence, and shouldering the load. But those qualities, once he left the locker room and stepped into family life, were no longer advantages. They became pressures, even seeds of conflict. In his role as leader, Jason Kidd had been taught that emotions must be suppressed, that hesitation signals weakness, that the one in charge is not allowed to waver. And he brought that entire logic home, without realizing that marriage doesn't operate like a basketball team, that a partner doesn't need a commander, but someone who can listen, acknowledge fragility, admit what they can't control. But Jason Kidd wasn't equipped with those skills. He didn't know how to express emotions because his whole life had taught him they needed to be locked away. He didn't know how to ask for help because from very early on, he had learned he had to stand alone, that relying on others meant losing control. The silence that once helped him survive in Oakland and lead teammates on the court now became a wall in the family, a wall he himself didn't know how to tear down. Jason Kidd's marriage faced pressure from many sides, but the deepest was the pressure of power and role. On the court, he was the decision-maker for others, the brain directing the tempo, the one with final responsibility. At home, that role didn't disappear, it just changed context. He unconsciously applied the same approach, the same need for control, the same habit of not voicing what he was enduring. That created a dangerous imbalance, where one side had to bear the silence and tension of the other without understanding why, where gaps weren't filled with words, but with accumulated doubt and hurt. Jason Kidd didn't intend to hurt, but he also didn't know how to heal because he himself had never been taught how to face his own soft parts. Family, which should have been where he could take off the leader jersey, instead became where he wore it even deeper. Every unresolved conflict, every unspoken emotion, every choice of silence over dialogue felt like a bad play in a game. But unlike a game, there was no buzzer to end the quarter, no scoreboard to start over. Pressure piled on pressure, and in the private space of personal life, cracks began to appear. Jason Kidd kept carrying, kept staying silent, kept believing that time and discipline would fix everything, just as he once believed practice would solve every problem on the court. But family doesn't work by that logic. What isn't spoken doesn't disappear. It only grows quietly, turning the home into a place of prolonged tension, where each other's presence no longer brings safety. Jason Kidd's role as husband drifted further from the leader role he knew so well. He wasn't lacking in responsibility, but he was lacking in connection. He could spend hours breaking down a game, but didn't know how to start a conversation about his own feelings. He could endure physical pain without complaint, but was awkward in the face of the emotional pain of the person next to him. And in that awkwardness, family stopped being a place to recover and became a place exposing his deepest limits. Those limits didn't come from malice or lack of care. They came from a long process of being trained to be strong at all costs. The tragedy of this period lies in Jason Kidd, not realizing he was fighting on two fronts at once. On the court, he faced visible opponents, strategy and time, clear wins and losses. In the family, he faced invisible ones, silence, unspoken expectations, accumulated wounds. He was used to enduring alone, but didn't realize that in private life, that endurance wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as distance. And as the distance grew, family stopped being a place to return to and became a battlefield where each side carried their own pain. Jason Kidd walked through this period with the same instinct that had followed him his whole life. Keep standing. Keep not falling. Keep carrying responsibility without asking if he still had the strength. But the price of that unselective resilience was a quiet breaking, a sense of failure never recorded in any stat line. Family wasn't a refuge not because of a lack of love, but because he didn't know how to set down the weapons that had helped him survive out there. And it was in that tragedy that Jason Kidd began stepping into the most painful phase of his life, where what he once believed was strength became the cause of hurt, and where that second battlefield left scars no less deep than any loss on the court. The biggest event in Jason Kidd's life didn't come from a fateful loss or a career-ending injury, but from the moment his private life was dragged into the light, where every layer of control he had built over many years suddenly collapsed in heavy silence. The domestic violence incident, the arrest, and the media storm that followed weren't just a legal event. It was a stain that never fades, a marker that changed how the world saw him, and more profoundly, changed how he was forced to see himself. On the court, Jason Kidd was used to judgment based on film and stat sheets. Off the court, he faced a different kind of judgment, moral, emotional, and with no clock to end the quarter. Cold headlines flooded in, condemnations poured down, and an image framed by a single incident, without context, without time. In that moment, power, fame, and everything he once controlled became meaningless. What made this tragedy so painful wasn't just the wrongdoing and its legal consequences, but the way Jason Kidd chose to face it. He didn't step in front of cameras to defend himself to the public. He didn't tell his side of the story, didn't try to explain, didn't use words to soften what happened. He didn't beg for forgiveness, didn't build a redemption arc staged for the media. His silence wasn't avoidance. It was the familiar choice of a man who had spent his whole life believing that taking responsibility meant enduring alone. On the court, silence helped him control the game's tempo. Off the court, silence became self-imposed punishment, where he accepted carrying the shame without sharing it with anyone. The media showed no mercy, and perhaps it didn't need to. Articles didn't wait for him to speak. Comments didn't wait for him to make amends. Jason Kidd, once the symbol of intelligence and discipline, was reduced to a headline, an incident, a verdict. In that world, there was no room for the complexity of a human being, only quick-drawn black and white lines. And he stood there, not refuting, not justifying, as if accepting that some mistakes can't be softened by words. He understood that any explanation could be seen as dodging responsibility, and so he chose the hardest path: silence and endurance. That silence brought no peace. It carried long nights where memories replayed, where questions with no answers repeated. How could someone who controlled every detail on the court lose control in the place that was supposed to be the safest? Jason Kidd wasn't in the habit of digging into emotions, but this incident forced him to confront what he had long avoided: layers of piled-up pressure, survival-forged habits of control, and the lack of emotional dialogue skills in private life. Even so, he still didn't turn it into an excuse. He didn't turn the pain into a story for pity. He accepted that a mistake was a mistake, and the price couldn't be passed on. In the years that followed, that stain followed him like a shadow. Every time his name appeared, the incident was recalled without needing an introduction. Every subsequent achievement was placed next to a question that was never erased. Jason Kidd understood that some things can't be fixed by time. They can only be lived with. And he lived with it in the familiar way: working more, speaking less, closing himself off tighter. On the court, he continued in the leader role. Off the court, he withdrew, as if any exposure could make the wound bleed again. Not because he felt no regret, but because he didn't believe words could do anything better. The choice to carry the shame alone made him more isolated than ever. Relationships were tested, looks changed, and an invisible distance rose between him and the world. Jason Kidd didn't seek public sympathy, but he felt the alienation very clearly. Some people left quietly, some stayed but were never the same. And in that emptiness, he kept doing the only thing he knew: carrying the consequences, carrying the looks, carrying the memory of a mistake that would never be allowed to be forgotten. The tragedy of this incident wasn't just in the event itself, but in how it shaped the rest of his life. It drew a clear line. From here, Jason Kidd would never again be seen only as a player or a leader. He became a marked man, where every future effort had to pass through the lens of the past. But it was in that marking that a new kind of discipline formed: harsher, quieter. He didn't try to be loved again. He tried not to run away. Not to erase the stain, but to live so it wouldn't spread further. Perhaps the most painful thing is that Jason Kidd didn't allow himself relief after accepting responsibility. No moment of release, no public confession to close the old chapter. Each day that passed was a continuation of voluntary punishment, doing the job well, keeping discipline, and not demanding forgiveness. In a world accustomed to staged redemptions, his persistent silence was both incomprehensible and heavy. But that was his choice to carry the shame alone, the way he had carried responsibility on the court throughout his career. The stain never disappears, and Jason Kidd knows it. He doesn't try to hide it with new glory, nor does he let it define his entire being. He lives with it, every day, as a bitter reminder of the limits of control and the price of prolonged silence. And it is from here that his journey moves into another phase, where endurance is no longer a tactic, but a condition of existence, where continuing to stand firm no longer means victory, but is simply the only way not to collapse completely. After the indelible private incident, Jason Kidd entered a phase where silence was no longer a tactic, but became a lifelong punishment. There was no milestone marking a comeback, no press conference to close the past, no social ritual strong enough to declare the old chapter closed. Only time passing, and with it, a persistent, slow psychological weight that eroded day by day. Teammates didn't ask. The media didn't forget. The public didn't forgive. Questions weren't asked not because they had been answered, but because people had decided the answers no longer mattered. In that void, Jason Kidd kept doing the only thing he knew: enduring. The psychological toll of the silence wasn't loud like an explosion. It was like a long rain, small enough that no one noticed, but steady enough to soak into the bones. Jason Kidd trained more, as if every hour of sweat could substitute for the words he didn't speak. He spoke less, because every sentence risked being clipped, misinterpreted, weaponized. He closed off more, not out of arrogance, but because experience had taught him that opening up brought nothing but new wounds. In the locker room, he kept just enough distance to work effectively, but not enough to share. On the court, he was still the quickest to read situations, the coldest in decisions, but behind those precise plays was an inner life, with no room left for error. Teammates, for the most part, chose to respect the boundary. No one asked deeply, no one dug, because in a competitive environment, asking could be seen as intrusion. That respect, ironically, became a form of isolation. Jason Kidd wasn't treated worse. He just wasn't treated like a human being who needed to be heard. People continued to trust his professional ability, continued to entrust him with responsibility, continued to lean on him in tense moments. But that professional trust didn't equal emotional support. It reinforced the role while locking the door to sharing. And Jason Kidd, accustomed to carrying, accepted it as a condition of existence. The media, on the other hand, never forgot. Every time his name appeared, the past was dragged along like a mandatory footnote. No sensationalism needed, just a reminder was enough. Expert analyses still ended with a line of recall, as if to ensure the picture was never complete. Jason Kidd understood that rule. He understood that media lives on collective memory, and that memory rarely forgives, so he spoke even less. He let the work speak for itself, let time pass, even knowing time doesn't erase everything. His silence didn't make the story disappear. It only prevented it from becoming a new debate where he would have to explain the unexplainable. The public was different. They weren't used to complexity. They sought clear lines between right and wrong, likable and detestable. Once that line was drawn, very few went back to reconsider. Jason Kidd felt it in the looks, in passing comments, in the changed atmosphere every time he entered a public space. He wasn't constantly booed. He just wasn't welcomed like before. That indifference sometimes hurt more than opposition, because it said the story was concluded and no new chapters were needed. Against that invisible wall, Jason Kidd didn't react. He didn't try to convince. He kept walking, like someone used to carrying a boulder on his back with no one to help lift it. Training more became the rhythm of life. It brought structure to long days, brought a sense of control in a world where control had been wounded. In every practice, Jason Kidd found cold fairness. Do it right, results come. Do it wrong, pay immediately. That was the fairness life off the court, no longer guaranteed. Speaking less became armor. Every word weighed, every statement polished to reveal nothing that could be turned against him. Closing off became instinct. New relationships were hard to form, old ones hard to mend. Not from lack of goodwill, but because the energy to open up had been spent too much on just staying upright. This wasn't recovery. Recovery requires acknowledgement, dialogue, and a path to healing. Jason Kidd didn't have those. He had prolonged endurance, a disciplined, persistent, quiet form of endurance. He didn't collapse, but he also wasn't relieved. He didn't break down, but he also wasn't healed. Each day that passed was a fragile balance between continuing to do the job well and keeping the past from spilling into the present. There were long nights when memories returned not like a storm, but like a steady knock, reminding him that some scars never turn back into healthy skin. The prolonged silence also shaped how Jason Kidd was perceived. He became harder to read, more distant, and therefore more easily misunderstood. But he accepted it as part of the price. He knew that speaking up might bring attention, but not necessarily fairness. He knew that telling his story might soften some edges, but could also open new debates. Between those two options, he chose the least risky path: keep silent and keep working. That was the choice of someone who had learned too long how to survive through control. Throughout this period, Jason Kidd didn't seek applause-earning redemption. He didn't build a new image to replace the old one. He only tried not to repeat the mistake, not to let the darkness spread. That was a humble goal, but it demanded extraordinary endurance, because prolonged suffering brings no clear reward. It has no climactic moment for release. It only has continuation, day after day, in silence. And it was in that very continuation that Jason Kidd kept existing as a paradox, a man capable of controlling the game at the highest level, yet forced to learn how to live with the parts of life he couldn't control. His silence didn't erase the stain, but it prevented him from becoming someone else to escape it. He kept the discipline, kept the responsibility, kept standing straight under pressure, not because he believed it would bring forgiveness, but because it was the only way he knew not to collapse. And in that context, silence was no longer a choice. It became the punishment he accepted carrying every day, as a reminder that some life lessons don't end with recovery, but with endurance to the very end. After years, when silence became mental punishment, Jason Kidd entered another phase of the tragedy, one where the body began to break down in the slowest, cruelest way. No fateful fall, no live televised moment that made the world hold its breath, just gradual erosion, like stone worn by water over time. Injuries didn't come all at once. They piled up, knees aching dully, back stiff every morning, ankles throbbing after every practice. Those pains weren't intense enough to force him to stop, but persistent enough to remind him that the price was being paid steadily, season after season. This wasn't the tragedy of a sudden break, but the tragedy of prolonged endurance, where every season was another signature on a contract with pain. Jason Kidd wasn't the type of player who relied on explosive athleticism. He relied on intelligence, on tempo, on reading the game before it happened. But precisely because of that, he pushed his body beyond limits even more, because his mind stayed sharp while his body began to protest. He learned to hide the pain, adjust his stride, change his landing angle, cut unnecessary bursts of speed. Those small adjustments accumulated into a physical survival map, where the goal was no longer feeling healthy, but the ability to keep standing on the court. Every practice ended with the body stiffening in response. Every night of sleep was interrupted by pains that woke him midway. But the next morning, he still laced up, still stepped onto the hardwood, because stopping had never been his habit. There was no cry for help, no whining. Jason Kidd carried a harsh discipline with himself. If the pain hasn't made you fall, you can still go on. That was the philosophy forged in Oakland, reinforced through years of shouldering the leader role, and applied ruthlessly when the body began to betray. He learned to categorize pain. Pain you can play through, pain you need to limit, pain you must endure, and lived with it like a second language. In that world, healthy was no longer a state, but a rare pause between waves of pain. Whenever that pause appeared, he used it to accumulate playing minutes, accumulate responsibility, accumulate the trust of those leaning on him, Chronic physical tragedy isn't just about joints. It's the story of accumulated fatigue, long recovery sessions, unnamed treatments, repetitive stretches to the point of boredom all became part of the routine. Jason Kidd understood that his time was now measured by endurance, not by age. Some days, fatigue blanketed every decision, making it to the court already a small victory. But ironically, those small victories prolonged the cycle. The more he could endure, the more he continued. The more he continued, the higher the price rose. In the locker room, the tape jobs became as familiar as the jersey. Teammates saw him still there, still directing, still orchestrating, and that reinforced the belief that he was okay. But okay, here was a poor definition. It only meant he hadn't stopped yet. Jason Kidd didn't want to become a burden, didn't want special treatment, didn't want to change roles because of his body. He chose to adjust his game to compensate for what the body could no longer do, relying more on positioning, on passing timing, on anticipation. That was necessary evolution, but also a sign that limits were closing in. Each season passed like a payment cycle. Early in the season, the body could still handle it. Mid-season, the pain started reminding. Late season, everything became risk management. Jason Kidd entered big games with a quiet truth. This body had no margin left, but he was still there, because responsibility didn't wait for the body to recover. On the court, he still read situations quickly, still put teammates in favorable spots, still kept the tempo when everything wobbled. Off the court, he learned to live with depletion, where energy was tightly allocated to the essentials. There was no dramatic break moment for outsiders to easily sympathize with, no image of being carried off the court to close the chapter. Just erosion quiet, continuous, making every post-game step heavier, every morning wake-up needing a few extra minutes for the body to obey. This kind of tragedy is hard to tell, hard to see, but it clings. It allows no release. It only allows adaptation. And Jason Kidd, accustomed to adapting since childhood, kept doing it with his body, even knowing each adaptation took away a permanent piece of health that wouldn't return. That gradual erosion also affected the mind. When the body was no longer reliable, every decision became more cautious. Jason Kidd began calculating not just for the team, but for himself. When to push speed, when to hold tempo, when to pull back, to survive to season's end. That wasn't fear. It was the intelligence of someone who had learned that courage doesn't mean recklessness. But that intelligence carried sadness too. The sadness of realizing time was winning without making noise. There were nights when the arena was empty, when he stayed a few extra minutes to stretch, to ease the pain before leaving. Those minutes had no audience, no cameras, no praise, just a man facing his own body, negotiating every movement. Jason Kidd didn't think about stopping. He thought about how to continue without destroying what was left. That was a fragile balance, where every choice carried consequences. Chronic physical tragedy taught him another lesson about power. Power on the court couldn't protect you from the body's wear. Fame didn't soothe the pain. Discipline couldn't reverse time. All he could do was manage the price, not erase it. And he did it with cold resolve, not because he believed he would win, but because he refused to lose by giving up. Each season was a payment, and Jason Kidd paid steadily, paid fully, without fanfare. He didn't ask for pity. He didn't demand recognition. He just kept showing up, kept working, kept standing straight when he could. In a world that celebrates dramatic breaks, his story followed the harder-to-see path, the path of gradual erosion, where endurance is measured by the ability to bear rather than by glorious moments. And it was on that path that his body gradually became the most honest record of the price of never allowing himself to stop a record without climax, only continuation, season after season, until every step reminded that everything must be paid for, and he had paid with his own body. The NBA championship in 2011 came to Jason Kidd like the perfect frame the world had waited nearly 2 decades for. The Dallas Mavericks beat the Miami Heat. Dirk Nowitzki raised the trophy, and Jason Kidd, the one once called genius without a ring, finally had a championship ring on his finger. But that moment, though brilliant on television, carried a cold undertone that only those inside could feel. At age 38, when the body had worn through thousands of minutes and memories weighed heavier than titles, the championship was no longer a promise for the future. It was a belated full stop to a long journey where many things could never come back. Jason Kidd stood amid the celebration, smile present, but behind it was an undeniable truth. The title arrived too late to redeem. On paper, it was the perfect peak. A former MVP leading with intellect, a champion finally acknowledged. But inside, Jason Kidd understood that the trophy didn't erase the past, didn't heal the stain, didn't lighten memories rooted for years. The silent nights after the private incident, the unforgiving looks, the chronic physical pains, all didn't vanish just because of one title. NBA champion 2011 wasn't a miracle. It was just a milestone, placed on top of a cracked foundation. And because of that, Jason Kidd's joy carried a strange restraint. He didn't explode, didn't let himself go fully, as if he had learned that every happy moment had to be paid for with sobriety. That championship also marked the quiet completion of his playing career. Jason Kidd didn't leave the court as a hailed icon, but as someone who had finished the final task. He knew he had poured the last of his body's reserves into that season. The tense defensive minutes, the perfectly timed passes, the positioning plays replacing lost speed, that was basketball of quiet sacrifice, where every run was weighed so the body wouldn't betray. When the trophy was handed over, he didn't think we won, but it's done. Done with a long chapter, done with a promise to himself that he wouldn't leave empty-handed. But done didn't mean lighter. The title didn't make the years of endurance any less heavy. It didn't rewrite the stories already framed in public memory. Jason Kidd knew that for many people, the championship ring was the period at the end of all debates. For him, it was just one more line, added to an already thick record. He didn't expect the title to make others forget the stain, and he also didn't believe he deserved to be forgotten. That self-awareness made the peak feel cold. No illusion that victory would free him from what had happened. He accepted that some memories had to be lived with, not to show off, but to remind. During the celebration, as confetti fell and music blared, Jason Kidd still kept distance from the excitement. Not because he didn't value the achievement, but because he understood the price behind it. He saw in the trophy images of the years gone by: harsh Oakland, genius thrust into the light too early, the lonely leader role, family turned battlefield, silence as punishment, and the body gradually wearing down season after season. The trophy couldn't replace any of those chapters. It only stood beside them, as proof that he had walked to the end of the road carrying so many scars. Finishing his playing career at what seemed like a perfect peak should have been a beautiful ending, but for Jason Kidd, it carried emptiness. When the playoff noise died down, he faced a different question. If the title didn't redeem, then what was left? He didn't find the answer right away. He only knew his body no longer allowed him to continue the old way, and his mind no longer allowed him to celebrate as if there had never been damage. That belated maturity made him step off the court with a feeling that was both complete and unfinished. Complete in duty, unfinished in emotion. The title came too late also, because it was no longer a motivation to right wrongs. Jason Kidd didn't believe a ring could balance out personal losses. He didn't use it to demand a reevaluation. He didn't hold it up as a shield. Instead, he saw it as a stern reminder that professional success and personal life don't automatically compensate for each other. There are emotional debts that can't be paid with victories. And so, the championship trophy, rather than freeing him, placed him in front of a truth clearer than ever. In the moment of completing his career, Jason Kidd didn't allow himself to romanticize the past. He looked straight at what had happened. No additions, no subtractions. He understood that this cold peak was the consequence of going too long without stopping to heal. The title didn't lighten memories. It made them sharper, because now there was no big goal left to obscure them. When the final goal was achieved, everything else stood bare. And it was in that bareness that Jason Kidd stepped into the next chapter with a different mindset. No longer chasing the ring, no longer counting playing minutes. He was forced to face the parts of life the title couldn't reach. NBA champion 2011 closed the playing career, but it didn't close the human story. It wasn't an ending, it was a comma, a pause to look back, and accept that redemption, if it came, wouldn't come from what hung on arena rafters. The championship didn't save the memories, and Jason Kidd knew it the moment he raised the trophy. He didn't look for miracles in the title, and he didn't pretend he had been healed. He wore the ring like a complicated memory, proud yet sober, grateful yet sad. The title came too late to redeem, but right on time to mark that he had reached the end of the road with everything he had left. And in the silence after the lights, Jason Kidd kept walking, not lighter, not cleaner, but more honest with himself, ready for a new role where winning was no longer the only measure of worth. When the lights went out after the championship, Jason Kidd stepped off the court into a different kind of silence, one without tension, without countdowns, without specific goals to cling to. Retirement, for many, was a well-deserved rest. For Jason Kidd, it was a straight fall into emptiness. No schedule to mark the days, no locker room to start the mornings, no calls of leader pulling him back into the familiar role. For the first time in his life, he woke up without a preset structure, without a rhythm his body and mind had memorized for decades. And in that emptiness, a question he had never allowed himself to ask rang out clearly. If he was no longer a player, who was he? The emptiness after retirement wasn't loud. It didn't come as a shock, but as prolonged absence. Mornings without the sound of shoes hitting hardwood, afternoons without opponent film breakdown, evenings without pre-tip-off nerves. Jason Kidd, who once measured time by quarters and seasons, suddenly had to learn to measure time by slowly passing days. No scoreboard to tell him where he stood, no strategy to fix mistakes, no buzzer to close an error. The absence of those things forced him to face himself directly. No role, no title, no armor. Throughout his career, Jason Kidd had lived in a structure so strict it became his identity. Every decision tied to the team, every emotion suppressed to serve the common goal. When that structure vanished, he realized he had no language for leisure. Leisure didn't bring peace, it brought disorientation. There were days he drove around with nowhere to stop. There were evenings he flipped the TV on and off like an old habit, only to realize there were no games left to watch out of duty. That emptiness wasn't clear sadness. It was a form of being lost when the compass had lost its needle. No locker room also meant no natural community. Jason Kidd had once been in the middle of people who understood him without asking. A look, a nod, was enough. After retirement, those connections thinned, not from betrayal, but because lives moved to different rhythms. Everyone was busy with their own orbits, and Jason Kidd, for the first time, was no longer at the center of a circle. He learned to initiate meetups, to make calls, things that seemed simple but were foreign to someone used to being sought out. Conversations no longer revolved around strategy or playing minutes. They revolved around things he rarely spoke of: life, feelings, nameless days. The emptiness also exposed what he had avoided. With no packed schedule to cover it, memories had time to return, not to torment, but to demand acknowledgement. Jason Kidd faced questions he had once postponed. Had he lived right by those close to him? Had prolonged silence left irreparable cracks? Had years as leader taken away his ability to be an ordinary human? Those questions had no quick answers, and there was no coach to give directions. The body, used to high-intensity rhythm, also reacted to the emptiness. Without intense training, the pain didn't disappear. It changed form. Old joints spoke in new ways. Mornings needed time to warm up even without practice. Jason Kidd realized his body didn't know how to rest. It only knew how to endure. Learning to rest became a new lesson, as hard as playing at the peak. Rest required permission, and he had grown too used to never granting it to himself. No more calls of leader also meant no more daily validation. On the court, every right or wrong decision got instant feedback. After retirement, feedback vanished. Jason Kidd had to learn to self-assess, self-accept, self-define success in smaller measures. Success could be a peaceful morning, a full conversation, a day without escaping into work. But those measures didn't bring adrenaline. They brought stillness, something he had never trained for. In that emptiness, Jason Kidd allowed himself, for the first time, to admit a very human fear, the fear of becoming invisible. Not invisible to the public, he was used to that, but invisible to himself. When the role disappeared, he had to find an identity not based on control and responsibility. He tried returning to small things, family, light workouts, watching basketball as a fan. Each felt strange, like learning a new language late in life. Sometimes he felt relief. Sometimes he felt even emptier. But for the first time, he didn't use busyness to avoid emotions. Retirement also revealed a paradox. When no longer demanded of, Jason Kidd had to demand of himself. No schedule forced early wake-ups, but he still woke early because the body was used to it. No locker room, but he still found a space for old habits. No calls of leader, but he still felt the urge to shoulder something. That urge was both motivation and burden, because if not transformed, it would pull him back into the old loop. The emptiness wasn't the enemy, but it was an unforgiving mirror. It reflected the deficiencies hidden by the lights. Jason Kidd saw clearly that his career had given him structure, but also taken away the chance to learn how to live outside structure. He didn't blame the past. He took responsibility for the present, and in that responsibility, a new idea began to emerge. Perhaps, for the first time, he was allowed to learn how to be a human, not in order to win. The early days of emptiness didn't bring answers, but they brought something else: honesty. Jason Kidd no longer had to prove anything on the court. He had to prove to himself that he could exist without the lights. Existing wasn't winning. Existing was accepting. Accepting the unfinished parts. Accepting the scars that wouldn't fade. Accepting that titles didn't define the whole person. And in that acceptance, slow as it was, he began building a new rhythm not by whistles, but by small choices. When the lights went out, only himself remained. For Jason Kidd, that moment was both terrifying and necessary. It forced him out of the role he had lived his whole life to step into a space where no one called him by the old titles. And it was there, in the emptiness, that he began to understand the question, "Who am I?" If not a player didn't need an immediate answer. It needed to be lived with, day by day, until a new identity formed, not loud, not glorious, but honest. After the vast emptiness of retirement, Jason Kidd stepped into a dark night without drama, without any blaring siren in collective memory, but deep enough to leave a mark on his life. The DUI incident. No major accident. No serious injuries. No one else involved. And precisely because of that, many people brushed it off as a minor slip. But for Jason Kidd, it was a moment of drift, a clear sign of accumulated inner collapse, when fatigue had stretched on too long, and the iron discipline finally loosened for the first time. Placed in the context of his life, the DUI wasn't a standalone shock. It was the consequence of a long string of unstructured days, lacking anchors, lacking identity, after the lights went out. Jason Kidd had grown accustomed to living in a rhythm where everything was dictated by the schedule, by the locker room, by the responsibility he had to carry. When those pillars vanished, he didn't fall into loud nothingness. He drifted slowly, drifted in unnamed exhaustion, in evenings that stretched longer than usual, in the feeling that he no longer had somewhere he needed to be. The DUI wasn't rebellion. It was a moment of letting go from someone who had held on too tightly for too long. What mattered was that Jason Kidd didn't use the incident to play the victim. He didn't cite the past to justify. He didn't turn it into a story for sympathy. He acknowledged the mistake quietly, the same way he had faced everything since the earlier private incident. That silence wasn't avoidance. It was an admission of fault that needed no elaboration. For him, explaining didn't make the mistake smaller. Action did. The DUI exposed an uncomfortable truth. When discipline is no longer anchored to a specific goal, it can erode. Jason Kidd had lived his entire life within clear boundaries: win or lose, right or wrong, play on or leave the court. After retirement, those boundaries blurred. No more buzzer to signal stop. No more coaching staff to pull him back into orbit. In that gray space, a bad choice appeared not from lack of morals, but from lack of energy to hold standards that had already been depleted for too many years. No major accident, and that very fact made the incident more frightening, because when consequences don't crash down immediately, people easily downplay warning signs. Jason Kidd didn't. He saw the DUI as a signal, not a sentence. A signal that fatigue had crossed the threshold. A signal that he needed a new structure not to win, but to exist healthily. A signal that enduring couldn't be an infinite strategy. In the days that followed, he withdrew a little more, not from shame, but from clarity. He cut back on habits that pushed him to the edge. He rediscovered small disciplines, routines, moderate training, mornings with purpose. No public rebirth, no declarations, just quiet adjustments to patch the cracked structure. Jason Kidd understood that repair doesn't need an audience. It needs time. More importantly, he began to admit to himself something once forbidden. Fatigue isn't weakness. It's a biological signal of a life that had been overloaded. Recognizing that didn't make him lighter right away, but it opened the possibility of changing how he lived. The DUI, in that sense, wasn't self-destruction. It was a moment of release from someone who was exhausted, and exhaustion, if seen correctly, could become the starting point for learning how to care. The public doesn't forgive easily, and Jason Kidd didn't expect it to. He didn't ask for the record to be wiped clean. He accepted that for many people, the DUI would stand beside other stains as a footnote that never disappears. But he also didn't allow that footnote to define his entire being. He let his subsequent behavior answer consistency, proper presence, and not repeating. In the shadow of the mistake, Jason Kidd didn't look for spotlights. He looked for foundation. Foundation of healthy habits. Foundation of new structure. Foundation of allowing himself to stop before everything breaks. That was a lesson that came late, but not useless. It taught him that control isn't always about gripping tighter. Sometimes control is knowing when to let go. And so, looking back at the DUI, Jason Kidd didn't call it a forgettable stumble. He called it a signal that needed to be heard. Not self-destruction, because there was no intent to break, but exhaustion to the point of release. A moment of loosened grip from someone who had tensed for too long. Recognizing that helped him return to a harder path. Building a life that didn't need adrenaline to exist, didn't need lights to have value. The mistake in the dark didn't make Jason Kidd disappear. It made him slow down. And in that slowing down, for the first time in many years, he had the chance to choose a different way of living, less harsh on himself, more serious about rest, and more honest about his limits. No fanfare. No performative redemption, just continuing, at a different rhythm, the rhythm of someone who had understood that sustainable discipline begins with acknowledging fatigue, not denying it. After the mistake in the dark and the quiet adjustments to keep from slipping further, Jason Kidd returned to the NBA in a different role: head coach. For many, that was a familiar redemption path. Great former player returning to pass on knowledge, rebuild image, replace playing years with new tactical power. But for Jason Kidd, coaching wasn't redemption. It was just another form of carrying, where the pressure wasn't lighter, it just changed shape. He stepped into the new position without illusions that the suit would soften the past. He understood he was returning to a stage where the lights still burned bright, and the judgments had never gone away. The early years on the Brooklyn Nets bench came with heavy expectations. A natural-born leader, a refined basketball mind. People believed that would automatically translate to coaching success. But the NBA doesn't run on reputation. Jason Kidd quickly realized that a coach's power is far different from a player's on the court. He no longer controlled tempo with his hands. He had to control people, egos, and complex relationships. Every decision was judged not just by results, but by how it was interpreted. The same tactic, if successful, was genius. If it failed, it was stubbornness. And Jason Kidd stood in the middle, with no safe zone. At the Milwaukee Bucks, the burden grew in a different way. A young, talented, high-potential team and a coach placed under the microscope. Jason Kidd wasn't judged only by wins, but by method. He was questioned about player usage, practice intensity, whether his harsh discipline philosophy still fit a different generation. The media didn't forget the past, and every loss was read through the old lens. He was no longer a player who could fix mistakes in the next possession. He was a decision-maker who had to wait weeks to know if he was right or wrong. That waiting stretched the pressure, turning every day into an unnamed test. Jason Kidd learned quickly that coaches aren't allowed to be wrong the way players are. A player can miss a shot. A coach misses a choice and gets labeled. And for him, that label always came with footnotes. Not because he was worse than others, but because the past made every evaluation sharper. He accepted it without complaint. He knew returning meant putting himself under the lights again, and if he chose the lights, he would stand straight. Returning to the Dallas Mavericks, where the championship ring once closed his playing career, Jason Kidd faced a strange, closed circle. This time, he wasn't the passer. He was the one shaping the entire structure. Expectations didn't lessen. They only shifted from "can he do it?" to "is he good enough to lead the new generation?" Players judged him through every practice, every small adjustment. Media dissected every statement. The public kept weighing through wins and losses. Jason Kidd wasn't granted the privilege of patience. Every bad stretch immediately became evidence for a story already written. What made this role heavy wasn't just results pressure, but the unspoken moral pressure. A coach is a role model. Every behavior, every decision was examined under the question, does he deserve this? Jason Kidd understood he had no right to be wrong in the social sense. He couldn't say, "I'm learning." He had to prove continuously that he had already learned. That harshness allowed no recovery. It only allowed existence. Relationships with players were another equation. Jason Kidd had once been a player, once understood the locker room from inside. But understanding didn't mean easy. When he demanded discipline, some called it rigid. When he eased up, some called it indecisive. Each generation has its own language, and Jason Kidd had to relearn that language while still carrying old instincts. He wasn't a coach seeking to be loved. He sought clarity. But clarity was sometimes mistaken for coldness. And coldness, in the public eye, was easily labeled. The media continued playing the reminder role. Every tactical analysis ended with an open question. Has Jason Kidd changed? That question hung like a permanent moral exam. He didn't answer with words. He answered with packed schedules, late film room nights, small adjustments few noticed, but those efforts weren't always acknowledged. Coaches are only remembered when they win and reminded when they lose. Jason Kidd accepted that rule not because he believed it fair, but because he understood it unavoidable. Returning in a different role also meant old wounds had a chance to be rubbed raw again. Every criticism recalled the feeling of unforgiving judgment. Every doubt recalled years of silent endurance. Jason Kidd had to learn to separate professional feedback from self-worth, a skill he never needed as a player. He learned slowly, but truly. He didn't let one article dictate his mood for the day. He didn't let a bad stretch erase what he had done right. That was maturity, arriving late, but necessary. Coaching isn't redemption, because it doesn't erase the past. It only places the past beside the present and asks, "What are you going to do now?" Jason Kidd answers by continuing to stand in the fire, continuing to face judgment, continuing to work in a profession with no neutral ground. He doesn't expect forgiveness. He expects fairness in the present. And if fairness doesn't come, he still works because carrying the burden has become familiar. In the new position, Jason Kidd is still judged, just from a different spot. The lights still shine, just from a different angle. The pressure still exists, just in a different form. And he, after everything, still chooses to stay on that stage, not to seek redemption, but to keep taking responsibility. In a world that loves bright comeback stories, his journey chooses the harder path, returning quietly, working amid doubt, and accepting that the burden doesn't lighten just because the role changes. After years of being judged in every public role, Jason Kidd stepped into a role without playbooks, without reference film, without a buzzer to signal right or wrong, being a father. For him, this isn't a pre-written chapter designed to easily move an audience, nor is it a complete redemption arc the way people like to tell it. No showy moments in front of cameras, no perfect family images staged to balance the past. Fatherhood came to Jason Kidd in a very different state, cautious, careful, and carrying a quiet fear that he might repeat the very absences he grew up with. Jason Kidd didn't enter fatherhood with the confidence of an NBA leader. On the contrary, this is where he has been the most awkward. On the court, he knew when to pass, when to stop, when to control the tempo. In the family, there is no fixed tempo. Children don't operate on strategy. They don't respond with stat sheets. They need presence, something Jason Kidd had to relearn from scratch. He had no script to follow, no perfect model to copy. All he had was a very humble determination. Don't disappear. That determination sounds simple, but for Jason Kidd, it was the biggest challenge. For most of his life, he had been used to being present through a role: player, leader, coach. When there was no role, presence became raw. Fatherhood forced him to be there without lights, without applause, without anyone keeping score. Be there when tired. Be there when he didn't know what to say. Be there even when silence had once been his safest instinct. Jason Kidd learned that in this role, silence is no longer protection. Sometimes it is distance. There is no idealized father figure that Jason Kidd tried to construct. He didn't try to become a model family man to fix his public image. He didn't use his children as proof of change. Instead, he kept that life as far from display as possible. Not from shame, but from understanding that some things lose their true value when brought into the light. Being a father, for him, isn't a story to tell. It's a job to do every day, even if imperfectly. Redemption, if it exists, comes in an incomplete way. Jason Kidd doesn't believe fatherhood can erase past mistakes. He doesn't assign his children the task of healing him. He only sees it as an opportunity not to leave, not to escape into work, not to turn busyness into an excuse. Some days he manages it, some days he fails. But unlike previous roles, This failure isn't allowed to be ignored. It comes back the next day, demanding patience he had never had to practice. Jason Kidd also realized that fatherhood forced him to confront his own childhood head-on. Memories of a family with no room for weakness resurfaced in the most ordinary moments. He found himself facing a choice: repeat what he knew, or stop and do it differently even when uncertain. No referee blows a whistle for the right choice. Only the heavier sense of responsibility than any game he ever played. And for the first time, he couldn't use control to solve everything. He had to learn to be present without dominating, to lead without imposing. What's worth noting is that Jason Kidd doesn't give himself permission to be proud of this role. He doesn't view fatherhood as moral compensation for what happened. He sees it as an ongoing duty, a duty without an endpoint, without an awards ceremony. That's why he approaches it with a humility rarely seen in someone once used to standing at the center. He listens more, observes more, and accepts that he will make mistakes in new ways. But unlike before, he doesn't flee those mistakes with absolute silence. He stays, fixes them slowly, and keeps going. Fatherhood also taught Jason Kidd a lesson basketball never did: the value of small consistency. Not big moments, but showing up on time, keeping small promises, being there when no one demands it. Those things don't create a sense of victory, but they create foundation. And Jason Kidd, who once lived his entire life on fragile peaks, began to understand that foundation is what keeps a person standing long-term. In this chapter of his life, Jason Kidd isn't seeking perfection. He isn't rewriting his story with beautiful images. He's only trying not to disappear from the lives of the children who need him, from responsibilities that can't be handed off, and from himself. Redemption, if it exists, lies in that persistence. Not complete, not flashy, but real. And in a life that has had too many lights, perhaps this is the first role Jason Kidd learned to live without anyone watching. Looking back at Jason Kidd's entire journey, the legacy emerges not as a rose-tinted painting, but as a complete record of what happened, both the glory and the price paid. The Hall of Fame is an indisputable recognition of his basketball career, one of the greatest point guards in NBA history, the man who redefined the playmaking role with intelligence, defense, and the ability to make teammates better. The numbers stand the test of time. The decisive moments still get replayed. But at the same time, history doesn't close with a full embrace. It pauses in a silence where recognition exists alongside reservation. Jason Kidd is honored, but not erased. That is the crux of this legacy. He isn't fully forgiven by history, nor fully embraced by the public. Not because his achievements weren't big enough, but because human memory doesn't operate like a stat sheet. Memory keeps the stains alongside the titles and places them side by side. The Hall of Fame confirms professional greatness. It doesn't grant moral clearance, and Jason Kidd understands that better than anyone. He entered the Hall not as an absolute victor, but as someone who paid enough to stand there. Looking back without rose tint also means acknowledging the paradox. Jason Kidd was both a model of discipline and basketball intelligence, and proof that control doesn't solve everything. On the court, he read games like an open book. Off the court, he had to learn to read himself much later. The legacy, therefore, isn't flat. It has depth, created by years of silent endurance, wrong choices, times standing firm without applause. Greatness here isn't only what was achieved, but not disappearing after everything collapsed. The public often wants a closed story: mistake, redemption, forgiveness. Jason Kidd doesn't have that neat arc. His redemption didn't play out in front of cameras, and forgiveness, if it came, arrived piecemeal, unevenly. That makes his legacy harder to digest, but truer. It forces observers to accept that a person can be great in their profession and still incomplete in life, not to excuse, but to understand. One of the greatest point guards, yes, That's true, but that greatness doesn't make history comfortable. Jason Kidd didn't become an easy-to-love icon. He became a case, a reminder that talent doesn't exempt consequences, and consequences don't erase talent. The legacy, therefore, is persistent existence. It doesn't fade with news cycles, isn't replaced by new names. It stays, provokes debate, forces people to remember in an uncomfortable way. That persistence also lies in his professional influence. Later generations learned from Jason Kidd how to orchestrate games with the mind, how to defend from the point guard spot, how to make a collective run smoothly. Those lessons don't need moral consensus to have value. They exist because they work. And it's that separation between professional value and moral judgment that makes his legacy complex but enduring. Not being fully embraced by the public also means Jason Kidd doesn't get the relief of beloved legends. He doesn't have the forgiving arms of collective memory. But he has something else: the honesty of time. Time keeps both the good and the bad, and lets them coexist. A legacy like that isn't shiny, but hard to distort. It resists simplification. At the end of the journey, Jason Kidd's legacy isn't about whether he was forgiven or not. It's about the fact that he existed, worked, endured, and didn't disappear. The Hall of Fame puts his name in basketball history. Human history keeps him in a more uncomfortable place, between respect and reservation. And that place is the truth. At age 52, Jason Kidd doesn't stand at the end of a neatly arranged story meant to make people feel lighter. He stands there as a man who completed a brutal circle. No miracles, no full healing, no final victory to close every debate. He didn't collapse, but the price he paid was far from small, and it will never be refunded. What remains isn't glory, but the upright posture of someone who accepted consequences, no evasion, no excuses, no demand for leniency. Jason Kidd lived true to his role in every phase. Leader on the court, silent bearer of responsibility, man judged when the lights turned away, and a man learning to exist after every title fell away. He isn't fully forgiven by history, nor fully embraced by the public, but he didn't disappear. He didn't choose to retreat into darkness to escape memory. He stayed, worked, endured, and kept standing there as an undeniable reality. This isn't a story of redemption. This is a story of persistence. Some people aren't embraced by history, but history stands firm because of them. People who paid enough so the truth isn't softened. Looking back at Jason Kidd's entire story, what lingers isn't a loud tragedy, but a prolonged, quiet, deeply human pain. The most heartbreaking part isn't in single mistakes, but in how Kidd lived his whole life in the role of the one who carries from a harsh Oakland childhood, where emotions were considered a luxury, to entering the NBA too early as a leader not allowed to fail or weaken. Even when he reached the peak with the NBA championship in 2011, a moment that should have been release, that title still felt cold, unable to erase the private stains, unable to heal years of silent endurance. The story hurts more when we see him retire and fall into an identity void. No schedule, no locker room, no one calling his role a void that led to signs of breakdown like the DUI, not from self-destruction, but from exhaustion to the point of letting go. What deserves respect in Jason Kidd isn't perfection, but the fact that he didn't disappear. After domestic violence and unforgiving media judgment, he chose silent responsibility over public defense. When he returned as coach with the Nets, Bucks, and then Mavericks, he kept being judged just from a different position, with pressure no lighter. And in his personal life, he became a father not with an ideal image, but with simple effort. Staying, not leaving, not repeating the absences he grew up with. The lesson for Americans today lies here. Professional success doesn't automatically redeem mental life. Discipline and responsibility, without emotional care, become burdens. But at the same time, Jason Kidd's story also reminds us that a person's worth isn't only in being forgiven or loved, but in standing upright, accepting consequences, and continuing to live responsibly. A strong society doesn't just need perfect icons, it needs people who paid enough so the truth isn't painted over. If Jason Kidd's story makes you reflect on the real price of responsibility, fame, and persistence, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us on more honest journeys ahead. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video where we continue to look straight at the people who paid enough for history to stand firm.